the quote that I really wanted to show here, it's the kind of second to the bottom there on the left. It says, consequently, or sorry, right after that, individual cases of severe malnutrition are occasionally reported in medical journals in children fed inappropriate vegan diets. So inappropriate vegan diets.
Mhm.
These cases usually receive widespread publicity and have led many health professionals to condemn vegan diets as being nutritionally inadequate. This is in the 70s, and they're
That's
saying this,
insane.
right?
Yeah.
Right? Like, this
Yeah.
is exactly what we see today.
All right, what's up, guys? I'm here with two Matthews, Matthew Nagra, Matthew Medor, and we're gonna talk about some of the claims that John Venus has been making concerning the nutritional status of vegan children and whether or not we should be, worried about raising vegan children. So I'm going to be doing more of the hosting of this because they're much more head deep into the nutrition, but I do want to talk about how this all started. So essentially, our boy John Venus has started to host again. For some, that's a blessing. For some, that's not. And he specifically was talking about vegan children and how basically vegan children was one of the main reasons he stopped being vegan. Now, we're not going to get into how this contradicts what he said a year and a half ago. You all know that John flip-flops between many things, including why he stopped being vegan. So yeah, we're not going to really get into that. We're just going to cover the vegan children stuff. So how this all started was he made a couple posts concerning vegan children. I started commenting. And then he made this video where he covered this study that you're seeing on the screen right now. And he showed a part of the study in the video and highlighted the specific thing you can see highlighted in purple, where it says, however, more vegan and vegetarian children than omnivorous children were classified as stunted or wasted. Now, I was a little confused by him sharing this because I was aware that Matthew Nagra, who we have here, actually let him know that in the study, they accounted for why this was the case in the specific vegan and vegetarian children. And it was because of a potentially lower calorie intake, and also the fact that the parents of these children, some of them were short. And by the way, Matthew, both Matthews, if you want to correct me on anything, like let me know if I say anything like inaccurately. But I was confused that John had included this in his video, which was essentially the purpose of it was to show that we probably should be concerned for vegan children, because he was aware of why these results were there, but he still posted it. And he cherry picks this little section. He also didn't include the fact that the omnivorous children had a higher proportion of overweight children. It was all very, very odd. And so I commented saying like all these things, and he deleted my comment. And then I re-commented it. He deleted that comment. And then he deleted the post, like the whole video. And then from my perception, it seemed like he blocked me, but apparently he restricted me. I'm not really sure what that really means. So in the midst of all of that, Matthew Nagra and John started DMing, and they were talking about various studies, some of which we have here. And John was giving some of his problems with these studies and why he doesn't think that maybe they're enough to conclude that vegan diets for children are adequate, or at least can be adequate. So I guess we can scroll up to some of those objections and go at them one by one. And yeah, like I said, I'm gonna be hosting in some form, so I'm gonna read them and then we can go into them. So if you can see, there's some walls in there. So John's first concern, and remember, these are concerns that took place in DMs between them, and we're not going to show them because, I figure you guys could just take our word for it. So studies were too small, is what John said. The studies on vegan children were too small. So what do you guys have to say about this?
Well, I mean, for starters, what is too small? That needs to be sort of quantified, right? Is it you need X amount of hundreds or X amount of thousands of children? We're going to go through the studies that we have here, but we have several studies that are 100 plus, in some cases several hundred. So I don't know what else he would want there. But obviously we can present the information and allow those watching to really come to their own conclusions about that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and it'll be demonstrated throughout this video that, clearly these studies are not too small. So let's just say that objection will be addressed like just over the course of the entire video. Oh, and one more thing, I forgot to mention this, guys. Although this is a video concerning John's concerns over vegan children and nutrition, I want this video to kind of be like just a video that you send people to who have concerns over vegan children, because we're going to cover not just like what he objects to, but also just other studies, and just to give like a pretty robust case for vegan children, right, in terms of nutrition. So just going to make that clear. So if you know somebody who's concerned with vegan children and nutrition, definitely just send them to this video. And we're going to put both Matthew's social media links at the end of this video as well. Both have been absolutely amazing in the production of this. So the second objection was that most studies only address nutritional adequacy / growth, not cognitive health / gut health / bone health. And I believe Matthew Nagra said this is probably the most fair concern that he has.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that is true, that most of the studies we have look at nutritional adequacy and growth. We do have studies that comment on cognitive health, though, and in fact, a fair number of them do. As far as gut health, sure, we don't have a ton there. Bone health, there are some. But I mean, that, as Matt Medora was talking about earlier between us, I mean, those things can go either way, especially with gut health. I mean, we have tons of data on adults and higher fiber intake, fruit and vegetable intake, and improvements in certain gut parameters. So I'm not sure what reason we have to believe that it would go the direction of being worse, other than potentially some anecdotal experiences. But then, what can we really draw from that, given all the data that we have? So I'm not sure if Medora wants to add anything to that.
Oh, I was just going to say, when it comes to the gut health thing and the positive data, if anything, the literature we have would suggest that earlier introduction of foods that are beneficial to gut health and earlier development of a robust and full of beneficial strains of bacterial colonies would be better. So earlier, the better. And there's a lot of actual literature looking into bacterial colonies as a result of, say, exposure to something like breastfeeding. And because breastfeeding introduces a lot of beneficial gut microbes, that actually has very strong benefits on long-term immune health and other health parameters of children. So if anything, I think we should expect that earlier introduction of foods that have shown to be beneficial later in life would be even greater.
And by those foods, do you mean like what kind of foods are you talking about?
Just essentially different fiber containing foods. There's viscous fiber, and then maybe possibly some fermented foods that have a lot of pro and or prebiotics, all of that.
All right, awesome. The next one was anecdotes of kids not achieving adequate growth or running into other health / developmental issues that are resolved when incorporating animal products. And there's a parenthesis here saying, even said that they gained weight eating less calories from animals. We can get into that.
I mean, so we're going to touch on the research we have on kids and growth. So I don't know if we need to comment on that too much right now. But look, you can find anecdotes for any sort of dietary pattern. And, say malnutrition, inadequate growth, or whatever metric you want to use there. What we need to look at is data comparing, comparable children, often cases for these studies that recruited from the same sorts of organizations or potentially like Facebook nutrition groups or wherever. So you're getting a more level playing field. And when we do that, we don't see a huge issue with growth in the vegan kids. So that'll be addressed in a little bit. And as far as saying that kids may have gained weight eating less calories from animal sources, I mean, that's not really possible. Maybe outside of some weird issue where they're all of a sudden absorbing a lot more from the animal, but I just can't think of any real instance where that would be the case. So I don't see that being true. But then at the same time, a lot of people don't really know how to track calories and count calories properly. And that's probably the case there.
Anything, Medora?
I don't think I really have much to add there. I think it's kind of funny, the sort of contradiction he has between, we have anecdotes and the studies aren't big enough. It's like, let's just hand pick a small sample of people.
All right. Well, I think a couple anecdotes is more than these studies with more than a couple people, apparently. So
with more representative sampling, it's just
So although I don't think that we need to spend too much time on explaining why anecdotal evidence is so problematic, maybe we can just go over that, like, just really real quick. I mean, an anecdote is what? It's like an unverified, uncontrolled story that is just like oh, this happened here. Normally, the people telling you the anecdote don't really have a good understanding of all the different variables that went into the particular outcome. There's anecdotes going both ways. Do you guys have anything to add there? I mean, anecdotal evidence. Like, there's people that say, what's that quote? Data is the plural of anecdote.
Or anecdote or the plural of anecdote is data.
Something like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I can see someone like John. I don't know for sure, right? But I can see someone like John maybe empathizing with that a lot, because he puts a lot of trust into anecdote from what I've gathered.
Yeah. So the main issue with anecdotal evidence is anecdotal evidence. It can have high internal validity, which just means that the observations or the quote findings are valid, but it tends to not. So when somebody observes something that happened following an event, they don't tend to take into consideration all the other possible factors that could have also produced the outcome that they experienced. We see this all the time with people that the seed oil thing. Oh, I stopped eating seed oils and I lost weight and I feel so much better. And it's like, well, you stopped eating seed oils, you removed a bunch of junk food. You took out potato chips and fast food and French fries and all these common foods that include seed oils. But it's like, what if you were just having like a tablespoon of fried vegetables? Like that's totally different. So you're misattributing the effect to something because you're not taking into consideration all the other things that, and this is why we do studies, because they actually measure
crazy concept.
They use validated measures or methods to measure all of the potential variables that we do know can have effects on whatever our outcome of interest is. So an anecdote can have high internal validity, but it tends not to. Just some basic pointers on why we tend to value one form of evidence over the other.
Right. Awesome. And don't absorb supplements was another one.
I mean, he said there were a lot of studies. I'm not sure which ones here, so I can't really comment there. I know there was the video clip he put out on Instagram that he later took down after you commented, but that one suggested that, or that one was a clip of Dr. Greger saying something about how in one study, people who took methylcobalamin, which is a type of vitamin B12, there was like one person whose values didn't rise. Now, I don't know which study that is. I can't really fact check it or anything like that. But I mean, we have plenty of clinical trials, even as Medora was saying earlier, like people who've had portions of their stomach removed, and yet they still seem to absorb B12 just fine. So I'm really not sure where that comes from, or what data is being used to support that.
Something I just thought of now to comment on that is they're not even modeling the appropriate counterfactual to show that might be an issue. So like, they're not also taking that same person and trying to feed them B12 from foods. What if it's just an error in metabolism that the same thing happens if they ingest it from foods? That doesn't say anything about supplements not being effective. That says they have an error in metabolism. So we can't even draw that conclusion from if it's the case that that's the sort of thing that he's pointing to suggest that supplements are not absorbed.
And then we got studies corrupted. This is, I mean, like, where do you even begin with something like this? I mean,
like I was gonna say if the research is biased because it has been or because of, say, industry influence or something, it would be evident in the methods or in like unrealistic values or something. Like normally you can pick those sorts of issues out. If someone's going to claim that a study is corrupted, they need to show that it is. That's really plain and simple. As you kind of mentioned there, burden of proof is on them.
Right. Yeah, and there's a problem even with the vegans. Sometimes I'll see this where they see that, oh, this was funded by the egg board, and they'll just like dismiss the entire study. This isn't what you should do. The study should stand on its own. On the data should stand on its own 2 feet, right? Who cares about who funded it? It could give you an idea, maybe, of like, oh, maybe there will be messed up methodology. We should look into that now.
Right.
But in order just like completely disregarding a study solely based on conflict of interest. It's kind of like you can do it in both directions, and a study could actually be very good and really well controlled and all these things. But
and I can give yeah, no, I was gonna say I can give an example. Even there was a systematic review a few years ago about meat abstinence and depression, risk of depression. And I know Matt knows what I'm talking about. And they excluded a couple randomized controlled trials. They considered the only randomized controlled trial they included as low quality. And then they rated all this other research above that. And you know, they didn't really give a reason for that. They didn't even mention the trials that they excluded. And then you look at funding source and it's like beef checkoff funded. And that in that case, maybe that's why. Like maybe we can, you know, say that oh, they were a bit shady with their methods because of influence or something, but it wasn't necessarily the influence itself that made it flawed. Is these issues with potential methodology that made it flawed, right? And we were able to see that. So you have to be able to show that sort of thing in the study itself.
Right. And it's kind of a lazier way to go about things if you just look at the funding and then be like, oh, screw this study. Like if anything, it should make you, okay, let's go look at the methodology, like you said, and see if there's a problem. And we can make a vague inference about like, oh, maybe the reason the methodology was kind of messed up was because of who it was funded by, you know?
Exactly.
Okay. Healthy user bias. I guess you can explain that one, because I'm not sure if how many people even know what that means.
Matt, you want to take it away?
Sure, I guess. So the healthy user bias is just a concept that when we're looking at a certain exposure in a study and an outcome, in this case, obviously it would be a vegan or vegetarian diet and versus an omnivorous diet. It happens to be the fact that the exposure, which is the vegan diet, tracks with a lot of healthy behaviors, other factors that we know improve health outcomes, regardless of what we're looking at. I mean, if we're looking at cardiovascular disease, we can say something like exercise improves cardiovascular disease risk or reduces risk, and lower weight and other things. We can just go on forever, but that's just the basic concept. And the thing is, we have the studies are designed in a way that they record all these characteristics, or they record at least the major ones that have been validated to have some sort of effect on the outcome that we're interested in. And they actually statistically adjust. So essentially they're looking at how much of the difference in whatever outcome we're concerned with might be due to the fact that these other behaviors are beneficial. And then after we do that, after we find out, basically after we get a quantitative measure of how much those are contributing, we look at our main exposure of interest. So this, in this case, obviously the vegan or vegetarian diet, and then how much that explains a difference or no difference, depending on what happens in the outcome. And I think Matt pointed out here, and I think he said this even in his discussion with John, if you want to touch on what's really funny about him making this comment in the context of these studies.
Yeah, so I actually, I spoke with John about this, and one of the things I mentioned is that like when they recruit the kids for at least some of these studies, I won't say every single one, but for some of them, they're recruiting them from like nutrition related Facebook groups or other organizations where you're likely getting people with similar levels of like health related activity or exposures. And so you're sort of controlling for some of those variables at the outset. And then he also cited some research, which we'll touch on in a bit, where like half of the vegans or over half of the vegans weren't even taking B12. And so how can there be a healthy user bias favoring, these super health conscious vegans apparently when they aren't taking the one thing that just, every vegan knows they need to take at this point? So there's kind of a double standard there, although he did acknowledge to me that he actually wasn't familiar with the methods here. So perhaps he's changed his view on that at this point. I don't know, but yeah, it's pretty clear to me that they did take steps to minimize or even eliminate the potential for this sort of bias.
Right. And the next thing kind of conflicts with the previous thing. It said people don't know that they need to supplement B12/vitamin D. It conflicts with it because this is kind of the opposite of healthy user bias, right? He's almost admitting that people don't, and a lot of the studies that he cited were in that form, meaning it was not healthy user bias. I mean, we're not gonna call like a population of vegans who doesn't know to supplement B12 like an example of a bunch of healthy
whole food plant-based eaters.
Right. And then what was it? Ultimately doesn't think there's enough data to support the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics comments on vegan diets for all stages of life. So that's a good way to segue into like the papers. And I forgot to mention one thing. So could you just scroll to the VeChi paper, Medor?
Yep.
The highlighted section.
Yeah, okay.
So just a reminder, like this is the one that he cited in the video that I had a problem with. And if you see in yellow, that's where they cover some of the reasons why those specific vegan and vegetarian kids appear stunted. And then can you scroll down to the conclusion? So if you look at the conclusion, it says, in conclusion, our results indicate that a vegan and vegetarian diet in early childhood provides comparable amounts of energy in a macronutrient pattern in accordance with recommendations and can ensure normal growth. So this is interesting because the conclusion of the study conflicted directly with the kind of narrative he was putting out in his video. I'm not sure if he just didn't read the conclusion, but yeah, just wanted to point that out as well because, like, I mean, why would you point to a study whose conclusion conflicts with the point you're trying to make, right? We've seen this a lot with other people citing research on YouTube. Like they'll cite a paper and it's like, did you even read your paper? Your source goes against what you're saying. Now we can get into, I guess, the data on vegan children. And again, some of our going over of these studies is going to interact directly with some of John's contentions from earlier. From this point, I'll just give it to you guys. You guys can just go ham.
Alrighty.
Vegan ham.
So I don't know if you guys noticed, but what I did is, vegan ham. I kind of just labeled the major studies that looked at either entirely or predominantly vegans, and I put in the age range that they looked at. So basically, this one looks 1 to 3 years. One of the VeChi studies, one you're just talking about, looks at children that were 1 to 3 years old and looked at their health status. And I think what we'll just generally do for this part of the video is go through each of the studies, just start out and say what the population looks like, and then what outcomes they looked at, and just go through and see if there's anything notable for any of the specific outcomes. And if there is, we can comment on those. If there isn't, we can obviously just say, well, it was a pretty clear picture and there was nothing that really stood out. So we can start with this one. And as I pointed out, it looks at 1 to 3 year old children from these various diet groups, and it looks at their energy and macronutrient intake and anthropometrics. And anthropometrics are basically just measures of body composition. So like height, weight, waist circumference is also anthropometrics, things like that. So you can kind of just get an idea of the study design here. Maybe I'll just like cover a little bit on each part of these so that I won't read the whole thing, but if somebody does want to pause and look over it, they can. So they kind of just recruited children from those three that have been following those 3 diet groups that were aged 1 to 3 year olds from Germany. And they just basically made an effort to exclude people that did not have diagnosed diseases that could have affected the outcomes they were looking at. A lot of things that are like genetic, so they wouldn't obviously be a result of the diet, but they could affect the interpretation of the results. And then obviously another exclusion criteria, non-vegetarian or vegan diets, or very niche like raw food diets, or a lot of these studies actually mention like the macrobiotic diet, which is a very specific form of a vegan diet.
Just to interrupt real quick, and you guys will notice like everything that Medor is reading, like this is all just a great reason for why studies are so much better than anecdotes. Like the amount of things that they try to exclude and like take into account like genetic predispositions for other things that could affect the results. Like, I don't know, just like a big note to take throughout this whole video as we go through like certain methodologies and stuff, like just how much better this is than just random anecdotes that you hear from your neighbor, you know, about us, like whatever that you know. So just want to make that clear. Yeah.
So I just thought of something as I was reading over the little second part here. A lot of these studies are going to be a certain type of study. They're what's called cross-sectional studies, which is they're looking at the status of the population at a one time point. And typically, we would be very concerned with this, because if we're interested in the effect of some type of exposure on an outcome and you look at one time point, it's like, well, what was it like before? Is it just now that they're having exposure to whatever, if it's smoking or high lipid levels or high blood glucose or whatever? Is it just now, and the rest of their life they were fine, and this is just a snapshot, and we can't really rule out that it's just a coincidence that they occurred together? But in this case, it's actually okay, because the way they're doing it is that they're recruiting people that they know have followed the diet and basically undergone the exposure of interest here, just at certain time points. So like obviously the different ages are the certain time points. So they've been following it since from birth to age 1, 2, or 3 in this case. So let's see, they just, go over a lot of the sample characteristics here, and mention that they didn't differ with respect to a lot of major characteristics like age and sex, and the majority of families had similar socioeconomic statuses, things like that. No significant differences in breastfeeding between diets. And I think the main difference, that stood out with respect to breastfeeding was that the vegan children were fed exclusively unintolerant, longer than the vegetarians and omnivorous children. And a lot of them were continuously breastfed during dietary recording. But the intake was not different between groups. And then, as I already mentioned, the socioeconomic status, no real difference between the groups. So this did a really good job, like the sort of thing that Matt was pointing out, like with their inclusion exclusion criteria, they almost just naturally balance the groups on the other factors, the healthy user bias factors that John's concerned with. And then active, most children active, very active. So physical activity was the same. Seasons of the year, like they went very in depth, the recruitment during seasons of the year. And then one thing about BMI of parents, looks like median paternal BMI was higher in omnivorous children. So right away, that's like something, okay, maybe that'll have a little bit of effect if the father is heavier than the children, or the child, or the father or mother are heavier, the child may be predisposed to being heavier, or vice versa. And I don't think there's much else to mention there. And then we have a table here. I'll just stop at it so you can, if you want to at any point, look at this stuff. Kind of just what I went over already with respect to the characteristics of the children. And then we can get into the energy and nutrient intakes. Total energy intake didn't differ between the groups. And then after adjustment for potential confounders, the omnivorous children have the highest intakes of protein, fat, and added sugars, while vegan children have the highest intakes of carbohydrates and fiber. So that's actually something in favor of the vegan children. They had a greater fiber intake, lower added sugar intake. And then we can see here kind of just a breakdown of total energy, protein intake on a gram per kilogram body weight basis, energy, fat, carbohydrates, added sugars. I guess that's not too important, but it's nice to see that and get an idea of what their diet composition looked like. Like, was it some crazy diet? But they did a good job of, in their recruiting, making sure that they didn't pick up a lot of those types of people anyway. Then here we have Anthropometrics. So what I mentioned, basically measures of physical body status. I don't know, for the lack of a better way to phrase it, weight for height, Z-score, height for age, Z-score, and weight for age, Z-score, and Z-scores, are just a way to standardize these measures so that there's no real bias. Because when you use, I think the issue is that when you use absolute measures in growing populations, they might they might appear skewed. So it's better to use a more standardized measure. But you can see that there really doesn't seem to be any major differences. I mean, it's almost like dead flat lines for weight, height, for age, and weight for height. And then classifications. Oh yeah, the WHO classification on these Z-scores. So we can see the proportion that we're in each group. So basically like overweight or obese, possibly overweight or obese, and then normal or no risk, and then wasted or severely wasted. And that's kind of something we touched on earlier with the thing that John showed. We do see there are a few people in the children in the vegan diet group that were either classified as either wasted or severely wasted, or they were below 2 standard deviations below the average for their age. And then same thing with regard to height for age. That one was weight for height, and then this is height for age. We see a very small percentage. I think it ends up being an absolute number of like 7 or 8 children. And here's just the averages or means of each group listed out, and the standard deviations. And then just the tests for differences between the groups. And then we'll move on to, I guess we don't need to discuss it too much, but just to point out that, okay, there were a few children that appeared to be stunted. They were very small. They were short, and they did not weigh a lot for their age. But as highlighted here, which John left out, there are very clear explanations, for the lack of a better word, as to why we probably saw this. They pretty much, for every child that seemed to have a stunted growth in some way, that there was a reason that is not inherent to a vegan diet. So some of them had very, very low energy intakes, which is able to be alleviated with an improvement in
eating
the amount
more
of energy. Yeah, the amount of energy that's provided to these children. So it's like, just need to pay attention, maybe give them more foods that are higher calorie for lower volume. Maybe the parents were giving them stuff that was very low calorie, but it was high volume. They're getting full, and they weren't eating enough. And then they point out a difference in the length of the period of exclusive breastfeeding, which can actually result in insufficient intake of complementary foods, and also low energy, because you're excluding foods, and you cannot sustain for longer than a certain period only on breast milk. And I think I pointed out early on that there was definitely a longer period of exclusive breastfeeding in the vegans. And then 2 as well as 3 others had parents with heights below average. So this may have influenced the height. And then the other child with low energy intake was also small for gestational age. So they were already small at birth to begin with, which is considered a major risk factor for stunting. 7th was exclusively breastfed for even longer. And also the 8th, they note, also exclusively breastfed for a very long time. I think it's recommended at around 6 months. And I think there's another paper that goes over this. Around 6 months, you try to introduce other complementary foods. And also had parents below national average. So it's like a culmination of factors working against them, and nothing that is, my main point was, nothing that is inherent to the diet itself.
Yeah, that's like probably the most important thing to emphasize, that like these things the meat eating group could have also had like these things.
So it's something to watch out for. It's something to watch out for in any child. It may be the case that some parents are just less informed about that, and they should be extra diligent with regard to vegetarian and vegan diets. But obviously, as we pointed out, their conclusion's pretty clear that these diets can support adequate nutrition for children, at least in this age range. And they said that this cohort actually provides a really good baseline for following these children up for a longer time. So hopefully actually within the next few years, we'll start to see publications that were prospective in nature. So they obviously, this is baseline. They recruited the group and then they followed them up and see how they fare. And the one thing they didn't do in this study was look at micronutrient intake and status. And I can't remember if they looked at status.
They didn't look at status in this one. In the second one they didn't, yeah.
So in the second one, they took like a broader look at nutrient intake. They also looked at micronutrient and fatty acid intake rather than just the very basic. I think we showed it was like energy, protein, fat, and things like that. And this is the same cohort, same age range, obviously. So I don't think we really need to go over that too much. We can scroll down again, characteristics, pretty evenly distributed for most of them. We can see actually here the breast milk intake and the duration are where we see differences. And then we can move on to their actual findings, their main outcomes, the micronutrient intake. And they looked at intake without supplements and intake with supplements. And without supplements, a lot of the vitamin intakes differed between the groups. Sounds scary, but it's actually a good thing in the case of vegetarian and vegan children, except for vitamin A and vitamin D, which is interesting. The vegan children had the highest intake of EK, B1, B6, folate. I don't think I need to really go through all of this, but maybe point out the things where they either had lower intake or at least an intake that was maybe a concern. I actually don't think in this case there was anything that really stands out except for, was it iodine, Matt? And that was across the board.
Yeah, exactly. Right? That was everyone.
Yeah. Everybody's iodine intake was low. And that's actually a product of more whole foods diets. They just tend to be lower in iodine because iodine, the predominant source of iodine in westernized countries is iodized salt, which either added directly or indirectly into processed foods and whatnot. So it's something that anybody with a sort of whole foods diet should be cognizant of.
Even though the low iodine applied to all three groups, I'm sure the anti-vegans watching are still going to blame it on the vegan diet inherently.
Most likely.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because like even in the cases where other like animal foods provide iodine in some sense, they're a decent source of iodine. Some of them are just not inherent. It's like for milk, I think in dairy products, it's they treat the cow's udders with iodine and it just ends up in the products. So it's like, oh, that's not even
it's also just a gross thought as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's basically to prevent infection because it's so common. So fatty acid, cholesterol, major differences were in the fatty acid intakes. They had much lower intake of saturated fatty acid in the vegan group, higher intake of polyunsaturated linoleic and alpha linolenic acid, and then obviously lower of the preformed omega-3 fats, DHA and EPA, and then cholesterol, again, obviously. Intake with supplements differed. Fat supplements significant. We can actually move on to this table because it gives a nice depiction of everything, and you can see where the differences exist. And this is note without supplements. So just to point that out because that's important. And they actually, I might have left out.
Yeah, there's another figure. So you probably
that's
fine.
I think I left out the one with supplements, but it's good to point out that these parents were very well informed, and supplement rates in this cohort were very good. for things like B12 and vitamin D, especially. And we can kind of, after that, we can look over and see their conclusion that there were major differences in intake of several nutrients, regardless of dietary supplements. And then after supplements, I think it ended up being that some of those that had differences before were not different after, something like B12 and D. And they mentioned the nutrients that the omnivores had the highest intakes of. I kind of went over those. Iodine's one of them, but again, all groups were low. And then they just mentioned a few that were intakes. They're not necessarily extremely low. They're just something that they should keep an eye on. Obviously, B12, I think everyone knows and acknowledges that at this point. Maybe iron, I think they mentioned, and calcium, just common things that anyone should be cognizant of. And then they just point out some of the things that the vegan children had higher intakes of, and they give really solid recommendations on foods or supplements to consider for the things that may be concerns, like for calcium, fortified plant-based dairy alternatives, mineral water. That's a funny one. I noticed that earlier today, which is true. There's a good amount of calcium in some mineral waters, like calcium set tofu is another one. And then
but supplements don't work though, so
yeah. And it's funny because they made recommendations for all groups. They made recommendations for the omnivores too, should consume more polyunsaturated fatty acid to actually reduce their risk of cardiovascular disease in the future. Fatty fish, so DHA, like even intake of DHA was low in the omnivores. So that's something that you want to point to. It's like, well, that's common in any group. And possible supplementation they mentioned for vegans from microalgae. I think that's pretty much everything that's important in there. So for that age group, 1 to 3 year old, we have the anthropometric outcomes, and we don't see any major differences except for a few children where we have simple explanations as to why they might be smaller for their age, and things that are very easily ameliorated. And then the nutrient intakes, the same thing. There are maybe 1 or 2 things here and there that, okay, we should pay attention to these, but it wasn't necessarily a major problem for these children. Just, this is important advice to give out. And they did that for every group. So
we're not really seeing a justification for supporting animal agriculture in the raising of the kids. So given all these results, most important thing.
Yeah. So I think these are the 2 main studies that looked at these very, very early ages in life. There's another one that we're going to go over that also included earlier in life, the first few years of life. And there's one that actually only looked at the first year of life. So we have all the way back down to birth, essentially. And I think I'm getting tired of talking, so I'm gonna let Matt go over the. This is another VeChi study, and I'll just set them up. It's just in an older age group. You can see here, 6 years old to 18-year-olds, so it's considered children and adolescents.
Yeah, and the only reason Medora is tired of talking is because of his vegan diet. Just make that clear.
My jaw literally hurts, dude.
Yeah. Need more animal protein for sure.
But yeah, so it's a similar study design, similar sort of recruitment, just older children, 6 to 18. They actually included one kid who was like 5.5 or something, and one kid who was, or I guess teen adult at that point, who was 19. But anywhere in that range for the most part. So I'm not going to go into the inclusion, exclusion criteria and everything again. It's pretty much the same, just a different population. And then you're scrolling through while we go? Yeah. So I mean, anyone who wants to, pause on this and look at the table, they can. But basically, we have relatively similar, I guess, slightly less boys, more girls in the vegan group. But they're going to adjust for all of these sorts of factors when they do their analysis, so it's not a huge deal. average age were about 12 and a half to 13 across the board, so similar ages. But we can, I think, go through that. Oh, level of activity was actually, that's another thing as far as healthy user bias goes. Physical activity was pretty similar across the board. If anything, even a little bit higher on average in the omnivores. So
yeah, that's funny.
So healthy user bias goes in the opposite direction in this case.
If anything, yeah.
Yeah.
So now looking at energy intake, we see that pretty similar, not a huge difference there, at least no statistically significant differences. So not too much to comment on there. Protein, now here's the thing, grams per kilogram of protein. So per body weight, protein intake between vegans and vegetarians was almost identical, 1.16 grams per kilogram in the vegans, 1.14 grams per kilogram in the vegetarians, but it was a bit higher in the omnivores at 1.36 grams per kilogram. But I'd say pretty solid across the board there. I wouldn't be too concerned about that either way. For fiber intake, I mean, the vegans had 21.9 grams per 1,000 calories, whereas the omnivores only had 12 grams per 1,000 calories. So there's quite a difference there. And then saturated fat intake, like 7.8 grams, 7.8% of calories in the vegans, whereas we have 15.9% of the calories in the omnivores. And if
what is the threshold where you're going to go over that?
Yeah. And so for people who aren't aware, where we really see risk increase is when you go from below 10% of calories to above 10% of calories. So for cardiovascular risk. And so we're actually seeing that threshold being crossed here between the vegans and the omnivores. And so this could very well be setting up omnivorous kids for a greater risk of cardiovascular disease down the road, which we'll discuss a little bit more when we talk about like cholesterol levels and that kind of thing, or LDL cholesterol levels in particular. Actually, there was I didn't realize it was in the text right below because Matt sliced up this one. So we have a little bit more information here as far as fat intake. Now, the median fat intake in the vegans overall was below the 30% of energy kind of standard recommendation, aside from the saturated fat, which you already mentioned. But they also had a much greater polyunsaturated fat intake, which is the more heart healthy of the fats. So that's good too. And then as far as B12, the numbers here don't include supplementation, so they were quite low. But as Matt talked about with the previous study on the younger kids, large portion of kids were supplementing. And do you remember the number here, Matt, for the exact percentage?
It's actually up in the, it's not specific to B12, but supplement use is
supplement
96, about 96%.
Yeah, and in all, chances are that most of those were taking B12.
Yeah, so I'll scroll. Let's see. This is just text going over.
Wait, to be clear, what was that percentage of the 96%?
Oh, 96%. So the percentage of the vegan kids that were taking supplements.
Okay.
So most.
Yeah, so micronutrient, I'll hang there for a second if anybody wants to look at it, and then I'll scroll to this figure on biomarkers and lipids.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, so hemoglobin is the first one there, and that's sort of the marker you look at for anemia. And so if you're iron deficient over a long term, or even actually B12 deficient over long term, that can affect your hemoglobin values. But we see very similar values between the different diet groups here. So that's not indicating a deficiency or greater risk of deficiency in the vegans. Now, ferritin, which is a marker of iron status, is a bit lower in the vegans and vegetarians at 29 micrograms per liter, whereas in the omnivores is 38 micrograms per liter. But even that 29 number, it should be adequate. So it's not looking like these kids are at risk of deficiency. For vitamin D status, very similar across the board, again, like we do to supplementation in a lot of cases. B2, pretty similar across the board. Folate, relatively similar, a bit higher in the vegans, kind of on average. Vegans and vegetarians. Actually, no, sorry. Vegans on average. The vegetarians are very similar to the omnivores as far as folate. And then we have other markers of vitamin B12 status. So if we look at MMA, methylmalonic acid, which is kind of right in the middle of the table above that horizontal line. Again, very similar between the different groups.
MMA is B12 in the tissue.
So it's a marker of B12 metabolism. So it's a bit of a better marker than just looking at serum B12.
Okay.
So again, very similar across the board. And the differences between, say, vegans and omnivores was not statistically significant. And then we look at blood lipids. So the ones that I would be most interested in are the LDL cholesterol and the non-HDL cholesterol. And if we look at those numbers, the vegans do have better values. If we look at the LDL, that's at 68 milligrams per deciliter, and that's sort of like the ideal range, or what's typically cited as being within the ideal range. Whereas the omnivores are at 90 milligrams per deciliter, which isn't sky high by any means, but as far as cardiovascular risk goes, certainly higher than we would see with the vegan group. And then non-HDL is even a better marker for cardiovascular risk. And we see a similar sort of trend where the vegans are lower and the omnivores are higher, with not a huge difference in triglycerides. And in fact, the difference there wasn't statistically significant. So for cardiovascular risk, it looks like the vegans are doing quite good here. And as far as nutrient status, there aren't any concerns popping out to me anyway.
The vegans are these vegan children are just suffering and dying apparently from these results.
There's text going over the nutrient status of blood lipid stuff that he just went over. And then you want to close out their discussion and conclusion?
And actually, I will also mention that while we were looking at average values there, in the text, they actually comment on the percentage of the kids who had values below cutoffs for, say, deficiency. And they actually state that overall prevalence of hemoglobin, ferritin, and folate concentrations below reference values was low. So that means as far as like iron status and folate status, the risk of being low was just low across the board. And then if we look at B12, there were 11% of the vegan participants who may have been at risk based on their MMA measurements, whereas 7% of the meat eaters may have been as well. So not a huge difference there. But again, we just want to make sure that kids or everybody who's eating a plant-based diet especially should be taking their B12. So just want to throw that out there, that the risk was pretty similar between the two groups. And then in conclusions, there was also the VeChi Youth Study confirms the position of several national nutrition or pediatric societies that a vegetarian, including a vegan diet, can meet recommended nutrient requirements in childhood and adolescence. So that's their conclusion. I mean, that's been totally supported by at least the few studies we've gone over so far. That there are obviously a few things to look out for, but by and large, it's totally doable. You just need to be sensible about a few important things.
Gotcha.
Oh, this is the one John said.
I think
do this one.
Yeah, I'll do this one. Then I think the next one is the farm, and you can jump in on that. But
okay.
So this Polish study was one of the ones that John actually cited to raise concerns about bone health specifically. Now this was and we'll get into the details there, but this is a cross-sectional study, as Matt has already spoken about. And really they recruited kids who had been following their diet for at least 1 year prior to participation. And they excluded anybody who was on treatment with bronchodilators or steroids for asthma, or who had conditions adversely affecting growth and development. Obviously that makes sense if you want to look at the impact of diet. And they also excluded people who were really outliers as far as like height and weight as well, at the outset. Now, there weren't any meaningful differences in age or sex between the groups on average, so comparable in that sense. They actually do mention that the mothers of vegans and vegetarians tended to be less educated. So that's something to consider, and we'll get into maybe some of the issues there. But vegans were also more likely to have non-smoking parents, which is obviously a good thing. And they tend to be breastfed for longer. It's another thing to consider.
Did you notice the comment about atheism?
Where is that?
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's There's a little comment in here. Vegans and vegetarians are more likely than omnivores to have a family history of coronary heart disease and have atheist parents.
Yeah.
What?
Wow.
It's weird
Why
putting
is that
those
in
two
there?
together.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so actually going
Yes.
down to the text on the second page down, where it talks about body composition, then down below bone health. So as far as body composition, we can look at the tables in a bit here. The vegans and vegetarians did tend to be a bit shorter on average. And then when we go into bone health, those characteristics, they did tend to have lower bone mineral density, even after adjusting for things like weight and height. So that can be concerning, right? It can sound concerning. But when we look at the characteristics of this population, I think it starts to make a bit of sense. So if we look at the first table there, right at the bottom of the table, so the left column is omnivores, then vegetarians, then vegans on the right. And you look at B12 supplement use. In the vegans, it's like 44%. It's less than half of them are supplementing B12. As far as fortified foods, there's 65% of them, and chances are there could be overlap between the two, right? So it doesn't even mean that you add the. I mean, it's not that we're adding the two together, but it's that there could be actually a lot of overlap and really a large portion of them not taking B12 at all. And actually, the next one does.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's right there.
I was gonna say the next one. Yeah, I wasn't paying attention. That's 29%. 29% weren't doing either. So 29% not taking a B12 supplement, not consuming B12 fortified foods. And that's a far cry from some of the studies that we've already looked at. As far as vitamin D supplement use, 32% or 32.7% not supplementing, or sorry, are supplementing. That's 2/3 who aren't supplementing. So there's a huge chunk not supplementing vitamin D either, which could be important for bone health. So we're looking at a population here who probably isn't, falling victim to the whole healthy user bias issue that was raised earlier. And they're actually not really doing the diet, properly as one might say, at least as far as supplementation goes. Now in table 2 there, if anyone wants to pause on it, that's where we have the height and weight scores and everything. We've already kind of mentioned that the vegans were lower on average. But if we slide down a bit further to table 4, table 4, we have B12 status. And for B12 levels, we see consistently that the vegans were quite a bit lower, in particular in the no supplementation or fortification group. They're really low there. And in the group only having fortified foods, again, quite a bit lower than we'd see with the meat eaters. With supplementation and fortification, they're doing great. They're right kind of where we want them to be. So that again shows kind of some of the issues there. And then finally, going down to table 5, which is the next one down below there, we see that vegans who aren't supplementing vitamin D have lower serum vitamin D levels than the meat eaters, whereas those who are supplementing have similar levels. So I think these issues can very likely explain at least some of the problems, related to bone health for vitamin D, but then also lower caloric intake. I can't recall if they commented on that.
I don't think they did, and I think you noted it.
Yeah, did I? It might have been in the text. I can't recall. But we can see that this probably is not a very health conscious vegan population, and they aren't supplementing appropriately. I don't know that they're a good model for us to point to and say, like, look, these vegan kids ran into some issues, therefore vegan diets are not suitable. Right? This isn't the sort of vegan diet that I would advocate for. Obviously, I'm going to advocate for proper supplementation and everything.
Right. It's very obvious that there's particular omnivorous and vegan diets that are not going to be suitable for good health. And one of them in the context of vegan diets would be one void of vitamin D or vitamin B12 supplementation. And it's not a really a controversial thing to say. And a lot of people, at least that go against the vegan diet, and especially this vegan children stuff, they'll cite this stuff as like a gotcha. It's like no one's arguing against this. Like we all get it. Like, yeah, supplement, cool, next, kind of thing.
And actually, if we look at table 6, I think this is good to point out. They actually look at, or they suggest the number or the percentage of participants who have possible or probable vitamin B12 deficiency, and obviously higher in the vegan group, not a surprise. But at the bottom, or second to the bottom, they have LDL cholesterol levels and they show kids with high above 130 milligrams per deciliter, 13% of the omnivores with high LDL cholesterol. And that's a pretty high value, especially as a child. Whereas for the vegans, it's 0.4% in that category. If we look at acceptable levels, 69%, about 2/3 of the omnivores, and 98.7% of the vegans. So again, looking at potential cardiovascular risk down the road, like that, there's a huge advantage to the vegan kids here, and we know that the earlier we can lower our values or get our values down, the better. So this is definitely a good thing that I think gets left behind a lot of the time when talking about these sorts of issues, because nobody thinks of kids as having heart disease, right? It's something that happens later on in life. So I think that's really a huge benefit that we're just not focusing on, or huge potential benefit.
They even make the comment in here about it's well established B12 deficiency and vitamin D. Having low vitamin D is avoidable with supplementation, and they just kind of point out that their results indicate it's something that needs to be considered.
Yeah, definitely pause there if you wanted to read that. That was a good read. I just kind of skimmed it.
Yeah, I was gonna say I hovered over it for a bit earlier, so I think it's good. I'll show this last section and then we can go down. Oh, more.
Yeah, there was a lot there, that one.
Yeah, this was a long study with a lot of results. Alrighty.
All right, this is your favorite one, right, Midor?
Yeah, this one's really interesting for a number of reasons. One is that it was done a very long time ago. It was in the 1970s, and they had a large sample, and they comment, or it's titled "The Growth of Vegetarian Children: The Farm Study," and it's called the Farm Study because they're in a community that was basically called the Farm in Tennessee, and they looked at children with a range of, they were aged from 4 months to 10 years old. So a really wide range of ages. And while they say, the thing I was getting at earlier, I kind of got sidetracked, was while they say vegetarian, most of these people were vegan. You can look at the summary characteristics here, and we can see that from birth to 2 years of age, 83% of them were vegan, and since birth, 73%. So about 3/4 since birth of the entire sample were
you should just
vegan.
rename this study.
Yeah. I was talking to Matt earlier. He was curious like why they would say that. And I think it's just the period where it was probably called like strict. It was more so called strict vegetarianism, veganism. And they actually note here, this is like there's so many reasons this study is cool. This is awesome. They made they detail their diets. They detail that they have grains and legumes, like really, really solid whole food based diets. They mention that soybeans are a predominant source of protein in their diet, and they actually produce their own soy milk that's fortified with AD and B12. And then they also use nutritional yeast, which is the source of a lot of the B vitamins. And that one looks like it was also fortified with B12. And then basically the reason they have a few, so they all started actually, the whole sample was vegan when this population first came to be. But after a few years, I think they mentioned it here, fall of 83, some members started to also consume eggs and dairy. Shame. So we have just very basic growth charts here, looking at the weight right here for males and females with respect to the percentile. So like 5th percentile, like only 5% of people are at or below this weight. 25th percentile, same thing, same concept. So you get an idea. And they have the values plotted for the children who were within each age increment. So you can see here, so like the children that were between 2 and 3, you can see their point estimate and then the confidence interval. So just basically giving you an idea of the spread and where they tend to land. And it's very consistent that they land right in the 50th percentile, pretty much for weight across all the ages. And then we can move down here. It's funny they say stature rather than height in this. But we have height, and you can see that it's a little, I think it's like in the beginning, the first few years of life, height is a little bit lower, but then it goes right back up and it snaps basically. I mean, it's almost like perfect plot on the 50th percentile line. So no major deviations. And then weight for height, same concept. The only thing we see a little difference with weight for height is as they get older, their weight is a little bit lower than their height. So basically lower than the average, which is actually in this case a good thing, because overweight and obesity is common. So in the standard reference groups, the weight for height is not necessarily, an average is not necessarily good. And it's not a major difference anyway. It's they sit kind of in the 33rd percentile, somewhere between 50th and 25th. None really in any really concerning underweight levels. And they comment on all of the children being well within the ranges. They comment here between 1 and 3 years of age. By 10 years of age, they were very, very small. And I think they go over, like I said, in the first few years of life, there were some minor differences. They were a little bit lower than the 50th percentile, but it kind of leveled out as they aged. And I think I might have actually missed. Yeah, I feel like I accidentally excluded some pictures that I had included before.
I'm gonna put the links in the description. So
Yeah, we'll have all the links to everything. But I just wanted to note that they actually discuss some other reasons that may be responsible for the slight differences in the age range that they looked at. I think including some differences in breastfeeding, some differences in what group is used as the reference. But even then, the differences are nothing to be concerned about. This would have been an awesome group to look at some more outcomes. It's unfortunate they only did growth, but it's pretty clear that even from birth. Oh, and another great thing I want to mention that I didn't point out: the vast majority of the mothers were also vegan when they gave birth during pregnancy. So that's really cool to point out that the mothers were clearly capable of birthing, lactating, and raising a healthy child on a vegan diet themselves too. I don't think, I wish I had those other parts. I must have accidentally deleted them. But if anybody's really interested, they can go look in. But they essentially just conclude that the growth, though modestly less at some time points, shows no evidence of marked abnormality. Actually, part of the growth differences may be related to limitations of current reference. According to the study, the attention to eating foods, children with relatively strict vegetarian, they actually say it's strict vegetarian, and they parentheses vegan, can achieve adequate growth. So that one's a pretty clear picture there.
So next we have actually 2 publications from the same study. This was a study done in the UK around the same time as the farm study, actually. So they recruited 12 kids in 1968, and so they were vegan kids back then. And then they recruited, I think, 27 more kids throughout the 70s and into the early 80s. And so if we look at the first table here from the first publication, we have overall calorie intake. So overall, just energy intake between non-vegetarians and the vegans, as well as the RDA, so what's typically recommended on the left side there, the third column. And we see that the non-vegetarians generally kind of track with recommendations, maybe getting a little low in the females at ages 3 to 4. But the vegans are typically lower all the way through than the non-vegetarians. So, we can suspect that that might end up impacting growth metrics, which we'll talk about in a sec. So if we slide down to the next couple images there, up top, we have on the top left, girls, their height for age. And you can see that generally speaking, although there was one that dipped below a couple standard deviations, but generally speaking, they're within 2 standard deviations of the average for non-vegetarians. But for weight, they do tend to be on the lower side of that all the way through. And that can be explained by lower caloric intake, which I just gone over. And now, as far as boys, kind of a similar trend. They actually had a few that were dipping below for height, but still most within that kind of 2 standard deviation range. And so, again, this can likely just be explained by differences in caloric intake. Now, another thing to note is that in this cohort, they tended to be exclusively breastfed longer than the recommended 6 months. So that may have also played into it. Either bottle-fed kids or those who introduce foods, at the recommended, say, 6-month interval, they might actually grow up to be a little bit larger. So at those young ages. So that could possibly explain some of the issues there. Now, they also looked at overall micronutrient intake, which we'll touch on in the second publication from this study. And just a little quote here. They say that the average nutrient density expressed as nutrients per 1,000 calories of the vegan diet were higher for most nutrients, with the exceptions of calcium and fat, compared with the average UK diet. So they tended, actually, as far as nutritional adequacy, did pretty good, other than, of course, having a lower caloric intake on average. They attribute some of that lower caloric intake to the low fat intake, and that makes sense. Obviously, fat-rich foods tend to be calorically dense, so it's easier to get in a lot more calories, whether that's through like oils, nuts, or in the case of omnivorous kids, meats and things like that. So we need to figure out ways to incorporate more calorically dense foods, which is obviously possible on a vegan diet. But the quote that I really wanted to show here, it's the kind of second to the bottom there on the left. It says, consequently, right after that, individual cases of severe malnutrition are occasionally reported in medical journals in children fed inappropriate vegan diets. So inappropriate vegan diets. These cases usually receive widespread publicity and have led many health professionals to condemn vegan diets as being nutritionally inadequate. This is in the 70s, and they're saying this, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like, this is exactly what we see today. And so I thought that was just such a great quote for them to throw in there. And it's honestly super surprising that they were experiencing that at that point.
It's like they're from the future or something.
Yeah. And then they follow that with children, or this was actually later, it's clipped out. But anyways, children reared as vegans can grow up to be normal children. Go figure. There is no evidence that their intellectual functioning is impaired or that the vegan diet adversely affects their physical stamina. The parents of vegan children, however, do need to take care to avoid the known pitfalls. And I think we've discussed some of the main pitfalls already. So don't need to read through the rest of that. Obviously, anybody watching this can. But I think that this study from decades ago really hits some of the major points.
It's interesting. At the end, it says they follow their diets for strongly held beliefs.
That's really good.
They deserve the same respect afforded to other groups that have dietary restrictions, such as Jews, Muslims, and Hindus. Interesting.
Yeah.
I would say more respect. And I say that as a Jew.
All right, and then for the next, this is the same cohort. It's actually a subset of that cohort. It's 20 of the kids. They just have the measurements for things like height, weight, and all that, and the averages were well within kind of a standard range. There were some who dipped, say, lower. Like we have the range of the different heights that they had. But yeah, on average anyway, they were pretty solid. And then for table 4 here is where we have the micronutrient breakdown. So bottom right. We already talked about it. Typically, the vegans did pretty well there, with the exception of the calcium and the fat, as we mentioned. And obviously, B12 is something to consider. Although they were getting some here, not a ton, but some. So supplementation is key. I don't think we need to spend too much time talking more about this study, though, other than some of those main points. Oh, they actually checked trace mineral levels in their hair as well, and saw that they were similar between groups. So they did a bunch of kind of interesting analyses here.
Cool.
But yeah, other than that, I think we can probably move on to the next study, and this was actually a recent one. This one actually got a lot of attention, and it's weird that it got a lot of, say, negative attention when referring to the vegans, and it's really weird that it did, because I think the vegans actually did really well here, the small sample of them that there were, but there were just some weird choices made by the authors as far as certain measures that they wanted to take, and just some of the language that was used throughout. So if we look at this, just the figure at the top, the observed differences in the diet. So vegans tend to have greater folate intake, greater polyunsaturated fat intake, especially linoleic acid and alpha linoleic acid, greater fiber intake. And then we have some of the observed differences in the blood. So folate, higher blood levels, higher levels of alpha linolenic acid, and actually cholesterol absorption markers. So that might be to do with when you don't eat cholesterol, you might upregulate some of those to absorb cholesterol through, say, bile production. And I don't know how much you want to dive into all of that right now. But then in the on the other side, we had a decrease in percent of energy from protein, decrease in saturated fat intake, obviously a decrease in EPA and DHA intake, and then again, obviously a lower cholesterol intake. But better LDL cholesterol numbers because of that anyway. And we'll talk about some of these other issues. So the retinol binding protein was a marker that they used for vitamin A status, but I actually spoke with the authors about this, about why they use that and why they chose to use the cutoff values for adults. And it didn't really make sense to me. I couldn't find good data for that for kids. And the reason they use that is because you need a smaller sample of blood, and they didn't have a lot after measuring all of these different markers. And it's difficult, I guess, to draw a lot of blood from kids. So I mean, that's understandable, but that marker anyway for vitamin A status is not what I would consider super reliable in this case. So I don't know that we should be basing a lot around vitamin A status on that, which was one of the things that they raised with this study.
So they use an adult range.
Well, yeah, so that they had their like deficiency range, and then they had their inadequate range. Now the I believe they were, we can look at the figures in a second here. I believe they were above the deficiency, but below the inadequate range. But when I asked about where that number came from, because I couldn't find any literature on it, they actually sent me to one thing that like translated values from retinol binding protein to like other markers of vitamin A status and kind of correlated them. And it was specific to adults. It's just not something that I would put a lot of stock in at this point,
especially for children.
Right. Might be different.
Exactly. So there are a few issues there. And then for vitamin D, total vitamin D2 and D3 were lower in the vegans than the meat eaters, but they were still within range for the total vitamin D and or vitamin D2, D3. So that's not a huge issue. They did have lower DHA status, but the authors actually noted that they didn't have any of the issues that would or could possibly be attributed to low DHA status. So around cognitive health or visual impairment or anything like that. And then
were these students, or were these, I just call them students, were these kids supplementing?
Yeah, a huge percentage of them were. Sorry, I'm just highlighting the figure here, but we can go into the study. A huge percentage of them were, I can't recall the exact number, but it was the majority, and they were working with, actually all the kids, they were working with, I believe, dietitians through their daycare. So they were all attending daycare. And there was actually a really small sample of vegans. There was only like 6 vegans and far more of the meat eaters, vegetarians. And actually, if we look at their growth curves for, say, height or even BMI, all of the vegans sat within or even one of them above the range for BMI, interesting enough. So so that's also positive. Mind you, again, very small sample. So I don't want to say there wouldn't be outliers if there were more. But yeah, looking at all of their their dietary intake. Obviously, cholesterol was way down at basically nothing, unless they're having the odd thing. Saturated fat, super low. Total fat, relatively similar. I don't know why I'm going right to left here, but I am. Protein was a bit lower in the vegans on average. Energy intake, interesting enough, actually average was a bit higher in the vegans. Vitamin A intake was similar. Vitamin D intake, similar. Actually, I should say for energy, it wasn't statistically significant difference, just it looked like it based on the average. Folate was higher in the vegans and way higher in the vegans.
Yeah, oh my God.
Zinc was actually higher in the vegans than the meat eaters. That's interesting. And then the iron was higher in the vegans than the meat eaters as well for intake.
Okay.
And then they also looked at, as I already mentioned, the fatty acid markers. This is just highlighting what I already said above: lower DHA. Certain. Yeah. Sorry, were you gonna say something?
No, I was just. That's pretty much all that I think is on this figure that's worth commenting.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything else really worth commenting there. And then for the status markers, so we've already touched on this. Just to give kind of reference for the top left there, the vitamin D, that bar at the bottom is the cutoff. And so you see that the vegans are at least above that on average. Actually, all of them more, if you look at it. If you limit it to just vitamin D3, which is more prevalent in animal foods or from animal-derived supplements, unless there are specific vegan supplements you can get now. If you look at specifically that marker, a lot of the vegans were below that, but for total vitamin D, it wasn't the case. RBP, retinol binding protein, we kind of already looked at that. So there was actually one vegan who dipped below the cutoff there. But again, not the best marker for vitamin A status, and they do note that. And then when they they calculated vitamin A status using a few different markers. And when you do that, the vitamin A status was actually adequate in the vegans. And if anything, one of the omnivores fell below the cutoff. So I wouldn't I don't think we can draw too much from either of those, honestly, but it is just funny that in that case, if anything, we can pick at the omnivores, right? It just depends how you want to interpret that. And then the rest of those, I don't think are super worth noting. Iodine status was similar. Iron status, relatively similar. And then the LDL cholesterol, again, far lower in the vegans. So the vegans are doing really good there. So that's really it for that study. Honestly, I don't think there's much else.
I threw in the comment about DHA.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Vegan children have not been found to have compromised declined visual function linked to primary DHA deficiency. So there's that too.
All righty. Okay, yeah, this was the one I mentioned earlier that was actually just looking at a group comprised of newborns ranging to 12 months old. And there's not, Matt made a comment on this, there's not a whole ton we can look at with respect to the effects of diets on outcomes, because I think I noted earlier that it's around 6 months that food introduction typically occurs, and it's usually soft foods. It's not whole solid foods. So it's kind of hard to really. I wouldn't use this to draw any conclusions about dietary patterns, but we included it because it's nice to point out the abilities of mothers to support the children and for them to.
I've heard some people say that maybe vegan mothers can't produce adequate breast milk, so maybe even still you can account for that here, maybe.
Well, actually, in one of the other ones, they looked at the volume, and I think the volume ended up being the same. That the difference in the earlier one, it was one of the VeChi studies, I think, was they just fed a little longer, which is not necessarily a good thing. Let's see. So just basic inclusion exclusion criteria here. They took people. They actually. It was pairs, so the mother and the child follows the same dietary pattern. So omnivorous, lacto, ovo, vegetarian, or vegan, and the diet planning. They actually recruitment criteria was involved diet planning coordinated by an expert. So they're not just winging it. And then full-term birth between 37th and 40th week of gestation, and conclusion of the first year of age at the moment of completion of the questionnaire. And some exclusion criteria: total change of their habits or partial or occasional change, and preterm birth. So 55 mothers with respective kids were enrolled, and they actually comment on nutritional supplement intake, which is really, really good. Obviously, I think that just owes to the coordinated information from healthcare providers. And then they basically looked at differences between weight and height. No statistically significant differences. I'm going to try to go to, did I exclude the table on this one? Or is this all text?
It's all text here.
I was going to say, I think it might just be all text. So yeah, they just, this text is just going over the results of, and they didn't find any major differences between the three groups in the anthropometric outcomes. I think growth percentiles, I think there was a just fairly significant difference between children in the vegan group and omnivorous in percentiles for length at birth and at 6 months. Values set at 12 months. So yeah, I mean, just a minor, it might be statistically significant. Very, it just made it into statistical significance, but the clinical significance is questionable. Then comparisons, more comparisons. Oh yeah, did they look at head circumference in this one too, Matt?
No, they did. They did.
Oh no, they didn't. Okay, they're commenting.
Yeah,
they're commenting on the fact that they didn't get to, not influenced by external BMI, least reliable. BMI least reliable. However, all differences have emerged. Harmonious and constant growth of all children was found, regardless of the type of diet. Yeah, so that's just the major conclusion. That kind of touches on what I was saying earlier about it might be a small statistically significant difference, but the clinical relevance is just not there regarding type of milk. Let's see. There's a little bit more comments on all vegan mothers prefer exclusive or almost breastfeeding, almost entirely breastfeeding. Unlike the other two, and breastfeeding represents a fundamental motive, but often accompanied by or replaced by lactation of formulated milk in their cows. That's really interesting. It's funny you made the comment earlier about the ability to produce for their children, and that the vegan group, if anything, seemed to be better able to support the children with lactation, which is really funny. From our study,
yeah, the person who made that claim, they were just making a basis claim anyway, so not surprised that the results were in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Difference in food supplements, obviously. During first all omnivorous took vitamin D, which is interesting to point out. That's not just consideration for vegans, and then vegans and vegetarians, obviously B12 and D and or multivitamins. You know, a little bit of a note on the frequency, greater than or once a week. Obviously, that makes sense. Unless you have a really high, I mean, some of the B12 doses, maybe you can do a bi-weekly dose, but typically it seems like they're doing daily or a little bit less than that. And differences, again, they just remark that pretty much everything was harmonic and there's nothing that stands out as potentially problematic. And then this study is obviously birth to 12 months is a very brief period, so they say they can't really draw unequivocal conclusions, which that's fair. But in the context of other data, I think the picture is very clear.
So So
For
at this point, is it just vegetarian stuff or?
Yeah, I was going to comment.
Yeah.
The remaining studies we just included, they don't look at vegans. Like this one, I think this one, yeah, had a few, but it wasn't enough to do any meaningful analysis. So we included these just in case anybody's interested or finds value from them or anything. But I don't think we're going to go through these in depth. The results, I mean, we'll just say generally that the results were concordant with the results of pretty much everything we've looked at so far. And if there's any issues, it's clear maybe lack of supplementation or low energy intake tends to be the explanation.
Yeah, and I'll put all these as well. I'll even like label it like vegetarian studies for anyone interested. But okay, cool. Yeah, this video is definitely getting long, so we can we can end it soon. I'll try to edit this down, but there was a lot of really good information. So I mean, I did like a 2-hour video with Nick on Liver King, and
dude, that was funny.
Yeah, it did really well. So I'd imagine this will as well.
Cool.
I think people like the long form content, so long as it's like digestible and like whatever. So I think this is pretty awesome. Do you guys have any closing things to say about vegan children? This whole topic.
Sure, I'll just give a idea of a general synopsis I have in my head, which is that if it wasn't clear, I think the available data indicates that with a adequately planned diet, you can definitely achieve adequate growth. If anything, there's a lot of things that shift favorably with regard to, I mean, lipids and intake of different variety of foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, a lot of health promoting foods in the vegan groups, which I guess is expected. But some things to watch out for, we went over. Definitely, like you want to pay attention. You don't want to do what I mentioned earlier, is give children high volume, low calorie foods so that they just can't get enough energy. You don't want to skip out on supplements that are essential. And trying to think what else. With regard to this, I would not do this. And I don't think anybody should try to figure out what's right to give their child without consulting a pediatrician or a dietitian, somebody familiar with the age group that can give them good information, because it's just any diet, regardless, it's just running the risk of doing something that might be detrimental, whether it be in the short term or the long term.
Right. I mean, the main point of this video is just to like illustrate that it is very well possible. And even though we've illustrated that it is, like, you should still like consult an expert if you're gonna have a kid and you have the resources. 100%, go ahead and do that. And then Nagra, anything?
No, I was gonna say it's the way you started your conclusions there sounded a whole lot like the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics position statement. Just like appropriately planned vegetarian, including vegan diets can be suitable. I mean, that's really, I think, what all this boils down to. Every sort of issue that we saw throughout, going through this research, it boiled down to something like inadequate supplementation, like not introducing foods at the right time, like, having too low of a caloric intake, perhaps too low of a fat intake, leading to a low caloric intake. These are things that can be dealt with on a plant-based diet. And as Matt said, obviously it can be really helpful to work with someone who is familiar with the age group and ideally familiar with nutrition, like a healthcare provider, as you mentioned. So it's possible based on the data that we have, and I don't think it's anything to really shy away from, provided that you just take a little bit of care.
Yeah, and John, if you're watching, I don't know if you are going to watch this or if you'd even make it this far, but hopefully a clear case has been made in regards to vegan children, and you can stop spreading misinformation concerning vegan children. That would be nice. Or at the very least, defend your position with either counter evidence or issues you have with the paper cited. And I'm afraid that these papers didn't control for emotion, which is something that John want studies to do, but you know, I think for the average person, this should be adequate. So yeah, all right, so thanks a lot, guys, for coming on. It's actually been a pleasure. You guys are awesome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. I'll put your guys' social media down below, and all the studies will be down below as well, including the vegetarian stuff that we didn't really cover too much. And yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Dude.
Fuck off. I don't want anything to do with you. Don't ever speak to me again. You're a fucking piece of shit.
Even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who is your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude,